and welcome back to another sewing tutorial. Today we are making this blouse, the Chrissy blouse, and you can find the pattern for this style on my website, studiocarolinashear.com. I'm going to link it down below as always. In this video I'm going to be using organza as my main fabric, so I'll be finishing all of my seams as French seams, but if you don't want to do French seams, that's totally fine. The instructions are with a regular straight stitch, so either way, I've got you covered. In this tutorial, I will also be doing the bow collar because I think that is a little bit more difficult than the bias collar, but of course you have the instructions for both of them in the pattern. If you do sew this piece and post a picture on Instagram, please tag me at studiocarolinashear and use the hashtag #CSChrissy so I can see what you make. And of course, if you have any questions regarding the sewing or the pattern, just shoot me a message. I'm always here to help. That is all I have to say, so let's get sewing. Check out pages 7, 8, 9, and 10 for fabric consumption, pattern layout, and how many pieces you need to cut of each piece. On page 11, you'll find information on how to calculate the elastic for the cuff and the bias for the binding neckline. For your main fabric, I suggest using a light to medium weight, non-stretchy fabric. As I said before in this video, I am using organza, but this one is in wool and I have another one in viscose, so you do you. You'll also need some elastic for the end of the sleeve. A 5mm width is good. I didn't have any black elastic when I was sewing this and I didn't organize my time. So I'm just gonna use this gray rubber elastic that I had in my stash, but I do suggest using a proper elastic band. You can also use some lightweight interfacing for the rounded part of your bow if you want your bow to stand more and your fabric is kind of floppy. Since I'm doing my top in organza, I'm not using interfacing because organza is transparent and it's already quite stiff, so I don't need it. And then sewing thread. In this tutorial, I'm not using an overlocker because I want to show that you can do this on your regular domestic machine, no overlocker needed. But if you do have an overlocker, just feel free to use that when it's indicated in the instructions. So for my pieces, I have my front body piece that is cut on fold. And if I were to do the bias binding neckline, I would cut away 1 centimeter around the neckline. Then I have my two backs that curve into a keyhole opening at the top of the center back. And again, if I were to do a bias binding neckline, I would cut away the 1 centimeter around the neckline. But since I'm doing a bow collar in this video, I'm keeping that 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then I have my two top skirts cut on fold, and since I'm doing the blouse version, this is the only skirt I'm using. Then I have two massive sleeves, and the armhole is marked with 2 notches on the front sleeve and 1 notch on the back sleeve, which is also marked on the pattern. And on the crown of the sleeve, there are notches to indicate where you gather it. And to the end of my sleeve piece, I will connect this little frilly bottom sleeve piece. And again, you have notches on this piece to mark the front and the back. So on the front you have 2 notches and on the back you have 1 notch. And since you have 2 sleeves, you also have 2 bottom sleeves. Then I have my collar piece that is cut in 1 but will be folded over, and I'm going to also gather the edges of this one. And then I have 4 bow pieces, whereas 2 of them are cut mirrored. Obviously my fabric is the same on both sides, so it doesn't really matter for me, but pay attention to that if you have a printed fabric. So if I were to interface my bows, I would interface just the rounded part, because otherwise your tail is gonna stand straight out and it won't really fall naturally. But of course, if that's the look you're going for, then you interface that. And you can interface 2 of these pieces or 4 of these pieces or none of them, depending on the look you want. So I will start with sewing 2 gathering stitches along each side of my collar. And since I'm sewing in organza, I will change my needle to a new fresh needle, super sharp for delicate fabrics, because I don't want my old blunt needle to rip my fabric or push it down into the bobbin case. So I'm just increasing my stitch length to max when I sew my gathering stitch. Then 2 stitches next to each other within the 1 centimeter seam allowance. So the first stitch is like 3mm from the edge, second stitch is maybe 5-7mm from the edge, just so it's enclosed in your 1 centimeter seam allowance. And of course, when I do a gathering stitch, I don't backstitch at the beginning or the end of the seam, so that my bobbin thread is free and I can pull it to gather my fabric. And now I'll just pull on my bobbin thread to gather this edge. Also, I'm sorry, I have a pretty rough looking burn on my hand in this video. I'm trying to hide it with my sleeve, but it sometimes peeks out, okay? It's fine, like now you can barely see it. I've been putting aloe vera on it. It's healing, it's good, do not worry, it's okay. Do that on both edges. And that's what that looks like. Now I'll put my collar piece to the side and I'll continue with my bows. So first I will sew the top edge of my bow pieces together, and the top edge is where the tail is the longest, so the longest point on the tail. And so I'm just going to pin them together. This is what I mean with the longest end of the tail. Now I'll sew these pieces together with a French seam. So to sew a French seam, I will sew my first stitch 5 millimeters from the edge, and I will sew with my wrong sides facing each other. So the right side is actually the side that is outwards. So you're going to see the seam on the right side. Then I will cut half of this 5 millimeter seam allowance off along that entire seam. Flip it wrong sides out, so the right sides are now facing each other on the inside and the wrong sides are now facing outwards. Then I'll iron the seam flat, and I'm just going to roll this seam using my fingers to roll out the fabric underneath to get those two sides of the fabric even. Of course, I'm using organza here, a polyester organza. I am using a very low setting on my iron to not melt this fabric. So you can see how I'm kind of rolling the seam with my fingers to get that nice and even. And this is what it looks like. So now I have my seam allowance in between these two fabrics. And I will now sew another seam enclosing the seam allowance within the seam allowance. I'm also really careful to hold my threads at the back of my presser foot when I start sewing, so it doesn't bunch up when I start sewing and I get an ugly knot there. Because I'm sewing in organza, everything is visible. And this is what my finished French seam looks like, so I have no raw edges visible anywhere. Now I'm going to flip this again to the other side, so my wrong sides that are now outwards are going to the inside and my right sides are going outwards again. And I'm going to iron this seam the same way. So just rolling that seam even and then pressing it with my iron. Then I'm going to take my bow pieces and sew it to my collar piece where I gathered the collar. And the seam connecting the two bow pieces I'm going to align with the center notch on the gathered edge of the collar. I'm going to pin this together and I'm going to leave 1 centimeter free on each end, and this is going to allow me to sew it to my body pieces later on. So I'm just measuring, so I put my last pin 1 centimeter from the edge on both of these pieces. And this is on the bow piece and the collar piece. Now I'm going to sew that together with a straight stitch, right sides facing each other. And I'm starting 1 centimeter from the edge and I'm ending 1 centimeter from the edge. So this is what that looks like, and this is how it's gonna look when the collar is folded closed. And you can see that I have 1 centimeter there at both the beginning and the end of this seam that is not sewn. So I'll just do the same thing on the other side. And there I have my bow attached to my collar. Now I'll cut away my gathering threads on the collar and I will fold my seam allowance into the bow, and I will also cut off half of that seam allowance. This is because my fabric is transparent. If your fabric is not transparent, you don't have to cut this seam allowance. Now I'll close my bow, and to do so I will use that 1 centimeter that I left unsewn. So on the collar piece, I'll fold up this centimeter into the collar so I don't accidentally sew in it, because I don't want to sew in my collar now. And then I will pin my bow pieces edge to edge with each other and sew my French seam along that edge. And I will close the entire bow with the seam. So again, since I'm doing a French seam, I am sewing on the right sides first, so wrong sides facing each other. I will do the exact same thing on the other side, so folding that 1 centimeter seam allowance up into the collar piece and keeping the 1 centimeter seam allowance on the bow out and pinned edge to edge. So really important to not sew in the collar piece now, only in the bow pieces. Because if you sew in your collar piece, you're not going to be able to attach it to your body piece later on. So I'm sewing this seam with 5 millimeter seam allowance as I did before, all the way around. Again, cutting half of that seam allowance off. I'm also going to just cut this pointy edge off. And now through the hole where the bow attaches to the collar, I am going to flip that bow out. And as per per usual, I am using my trusted chopstick to point my corners here. Now I am on the inside of my bow piece. This is the wrong side of the bow. I'm going to iron that seam flat again with my little finger roll. Iron that end of the tail nice and flat. Do that on both bows. And then I will sew my final stitch on my French seam, enclosing the seam allowance within my seam. Now when I do this, I will align my needle to where the seam connecting the bow to the collar ends, so I don't have a gap there. I'm going to sew this seam edge to edge with the collar seam. Here I'm also just folding down the other French seam so I get a nice finish on the inside. So this is what that little pointy end looks like. So here you can see the two French seams overlapping each other and looking pretty nice, I think. And here you can also see that my seam of the bow goes edge to edge with the collar connection seam. So I'll do the same thing on the other bow. So since this is the wrong side, I will now flip the bow pieces out through the collar connection hole again and just iron that flat, making sure that my tail is pointy. Okay, so the last step on the collar piece before we put it aside and continue is to sew one gathering stitch down the center of the collar, the center front of the collar, and you have notches marking the center front of the collar on the pattern. So I'm going to sew one gathering seam from notch to notch. I'm not going to gather it now. This is just so that I can gather it later on. This is what that gathering stitch looks like. Now I will put my collar aside and I will continue with my sleeves. So I'll start with attaching this little bottom sleeve piece to the end of my sleeves, and I have a couple of notches at the end of my sleeves. So I have notches to mark the front and the back of my sleeve, 2 on the front and 1 on the back, and then I have 1 notch on the sides where I align my bottom sleeve piece when I attach it to the sleeve piece. On the bottom sleeve piece, I also have notches. I have 2 on the front and 1 on the back. So now I will align my bottom sleeve piece to the notch on the side. I'll just pin the top edge of my bottom sleeve piece to this notch. And this notch is 1.5 centimeters from the end of the sleeve piece. So I will measure 1.5 centimeters along the full end of the sleeve and pin my bottom sleeve piece at that measurement along that entire edge. And then I will sew my bottom sleeve piece to my bottom sleeve with 2 centimeter seam allowance from the edge of the sleeve piece and 5 millimeters seam allowance from the edge of the bottom sleeve piece. And this is just a regular straight stitch, right sides facing each other. So I'm going to do that on both of my sleeves, and then I will create my tunnel for my elastic. So this is what that looks like. You can see that I have 2 centimeter seam allowance on the sleeve piece and just 5 millimeters on the bottom sleeve piece. So on my sleeve piece, where I have 2 centimeter seam allowance, I will fold up this 2 centimeter seam allowance to meet the edge of the seam allowance of the bottom sleeve piece. So I'm going to iron them edge to edge. Then I'll fold over the full bottom sleeve piece over this tunnel and iron it flat. And this is what it looks like. I have my tunnel created with my seam allowance. I'll just pin that in place. Now I'll close this tunnel by top stitching on the bottom sleeve piece 2 millimeters from the edge of the tunnel. But when I sew this, I'm going to align my presser foot with my previous seam so I make sure that it's straight and I don't follow my edge, because again, I'm sewing in organza. It's really difficult to iron completely flat. In order to get a straight seam here, I'm just going to follow my previous seam, but this seam is not really going to be visible because it's going to have the elastic bunching the fabric up. So if this seam is not fully straight, that's okay. So I'm going to do that on both of my sleeves. Okay, this is what it looks like. I have a tunnel, I have my seam allowance flap there on the inside of my sleeve, and on my outside of the sleeve, it is completely smooth. No seam allowance visible. Well, I mean, it's organza, so it is visible, but like, you can't feel it. Now I'm going to cut my elastic for my wrists, which maybe I should have already done that, but I'm doing it now. So I'm going to wrap it around my wrist so it's comfortable. It's tight, but it's comfortable. And when I have a good tightness there, I'm going to add 1 centimeter on each end for my seam allowance, and I'll cut it. Something to remember when you measure your elastic is that you need to be able to pull it on and off your hand and be able to wear it comfortably for long periods of time. Then I'm going to take that elastic band, cut it twice because I have 2 wrists, and put a little safety pin on one end. This is to pass it through my tunnel. So I'll insert my safety pin into my tunnel and feed it through the tunnel. When I reach the end of my elastic, I will put a pin there horizontally, because if I put it, no, vertically, perpendicular to the elastic, because if I put it in the same direction as the elastic, when I pull my elastic, that pin is going to rip right through my fabric. So the pin needs to be perpendicular to the elastic. I will pass my elastic through the full tunnel and take my safety pin out and put another pin at that end of the tunnel, perpendicular again to my elastic. Now I'll do the same thing on the other sleeve. Okay, so if you are looking at your pattern instructions, now it's the step where I hem my sleeve. But since I'm doing this in organza, I'm going to hem it a little bit differently, so I will hem my sleeve later on. So I'm going to go straight to the next step and sewing the seam of the sleeve together. So I'm just going to pin my sleeves closed. And again, I'm doing this with a French seam, so we're doing first 5 millimeters from the edge, flipping, ironing, and then the other seam. And when I sew over my tunnel, I'm going to backstitch over that tunnel to really enforce that connection and lock that elastic in place so it doesn't just rip out later on. So I'm just gonna go back and forth over that tunnel once, and then I should be good. And this is what that looks like. So my elastic is locked in that seam. I'll do the other sleeve. And again, cutting half of my 5 millimeter seam allowance off. Flipping my wrong sides out and ironing my seam flat. So I'm just going to pin my tunnel so my seams align on both sides. Otherwise, I don't really pin my French seams because I don't feel like I need to, but you can pin them if you want to. And then I'll close my French seam. And that's what that looks like. So this is what my elastic tunnel looks like. If I flip it to the right sides, you see that they are really nicely aligned because I pinned them together and the elastic is locked in place. So now I will hem my sleeve. I really like the look of a rolled hem on organza or like sheer fabrics in general, so that's the edge finishing that I'm doing in this video. But of course you can choose whatever you want. And if you have an overlocker, you can use that to get a really nice rolled hem. But in this video, I am doing it without an overlocker, so I'm going to show you how you can get a nice rolled hem on your domestic machine as well. So I'll just use my basic zigzag stitch. I'll increase my stitch width and decrease my stitch length. Then I will just sew with 5mm seam allowance, and the seam allowance will be enclosed within my rolled hem. Of course, settings differ a little bit between machines, so do this on a test piece first to make sure that you have the correct settings for your machine. Be careful not to stretch your fabric when you sew this, just gently feed it through the presser foot, because if you stretch it, it's going to create more of a wavy lettuce hem look, especially if you're going around a curved edge like the bottom sleeve piece, because there's some natural stretch along that angle of the fabric. And this is what it looks like when it's done. I really like that look, but of course you can do whatever you want. When you hem your sleeve and you have a French seam, make sure that the seam allowance faces the right direction, either back or front, depending on what you want. I am facing my French seam to the front on my sleeves, because on my body I'm facing it to the back. So that's just to avoid some bulking in the armhole area. Now I'll turn my sleeves around and I'll work on my crown. I'll do my 2 gathering stitches on the crown on my sleeve. So I will first locate my gathering notches that are on the crown on my sleeve. From my sleeve seam, I have either my back notch or my 2 front notches, depending on which side you're going on. And then I have my first gathering notch, then I have my shoulder notch, and then I have my second gathering notch. I'll just put 2 pins there to mark them, because they're not really visible in my fabric, so this is just to make it easier for me. And then I will sew 2 gathering stitches within my seam allowance of my crown. And there we go, that's what that looks like. I'm going to put my sleeves aside for a little bit and work on my body. So I'm going to take my front body piece and my 2 back pieces, and I'm going to pin my side seams together and my shoulder seams together, and sew this again with a French seam. So when I pin it together now, I am pinning my right sides outwards and my wrong sides inwards. Of course, if you are not sewing a French seam, you sew this with the right sides facing each other. So I'm not going to explain how to do the French seam, every single seam. You get the drill. I sew, I cut, I iron, I sew. Okay, so my shoulder seams are sewn, my side seams are sewn. I am going to iron these seams to the back if you're sewing this with a regular stitch and you have your seam allowance not enclosed within the French seam. You should iron this open. Now I'm going to sew my center back. And on my center back, I have 1 notch where my keyhole opening starts to curve. And when I close my center back, I will close it only up to that notch and leave the top of my center back open. But before I sew it, I will prepare this edge for a nice edge finishing. So I'll iron my seam allowance along my center back into a double fold. And I have 2 centimeter seam allowance on my center back. I have a notch on the neckline of my center back and a notch on the hemline of my center back, marking 2 centimeters. So I'll just fold it there, iron that flat. That value I'll then fold in half, marking 1 centimeter. And this will make my 1 centimeter double fold. But I'm not gonna sew it now. This is just to make my sewing easier later on. So what I'll do now is fold that seam allowance open and pin it at the center back up to my notch. Then I'll close my center back by sewing in that 2 centimeter notch fold up until my notch for the keyhole opening. Then I'll iron that seam flat and re-iron my double fold. Now I will top stitch this folded value down. And this is what that looks like. I have my center seam in the middle, and I have my 2 top stitching seams on either side of that center seam. Now I will do a bar tack stitch to reinforce where my keyhole opening starts, because that is going to be under a little extra stress when I take my garment on and off. So I'll just do a bar tack stitch perpendicular to my previous stitches. And there you go, that's what that looks like. Now I'll move on to my skirt pieces. So I will sew my side seams of my skirt together first. And again, of course, I am doing French seams. So I'll sew both of the side seams of the skirt pieces together. Then again, I'll iron my seam allowance to the back. Then I'll hem my skirt the same way as I hemmed my sleeve with my little rolled hem. I'm just going to give that a quick press to get rid of any waviness. And then I will gather the top of my skirt. So I'll locate my center front and my center back on the skirts, and then I will do my 2 gathering stitches on the front skirt and then on the back skirt. I will start and end at the side seams each time. This is going to make it a lot easier for me to gather my skirt instead of having one continuous gathered seam going around the entire skirt by doing it in 2 sections like this. Also, if one of your seams break, you're gonna have less work to redo if you do it in 2 sections. And since I'm gathering quite a lot of fabric now, I have a technique that I will show you. So I'll do my first gathering stitch on my front and then my back. Then when I do my second gathering stitch, I am going to pull my top thread a little bit to create some tension. So I'll start my seam slowly, not pulling too much, and then when I have a couple of stitches in, I'm going to start pulling that upper thread. You can see that tension in the thread gathers the fabric. So I'm just going to do that all the way to the next side seam, and then I'll take my thread out and I'll redo it again on the other skirt piece. And there we go, that's a super cute little tutu skirt. So now I'm going to pin my skirt to my body pieces, and I'm pinning my side seams and my center notches together. So I'm matching up my side seams and my center notches. Then when I have these 4 points pinned, I will gather each section of the skirt to match the width of that section of the body. This is a little tedious, but if you do it this way, I think it goes quicker and you get a much more even result. So I'll just gather along and pin in place, section by section. And then, surprise, surprise, I'm sewing this with a French seam. So you know the procedure. And sewing the gathers with a French seam is exactly the same way as sewing anything else with a French seam. It just creates a little bit more bulk, but honestly in organza, it's so thin, it doesn't even matter. Then I will iron the seam allowance up into my body because that's how it falls naturally, so that's what it's going to do either way. And now I'll attach my sleeves. So I will take my 2 sleeves, I'll locate my 2 front notches and my back notch on my sleeve, and I will match those notches to the notches on the armholes. So I'll pin my sleeve seam together with my side seam on my body, and I chose to put my seam allowance of my sleeve to the front and the body seam allowance to the back. And then I'll pin my shoulder notch to my shoulder, and then I will pin the rest of my armhole. So I'll just pin my sleeve up to the gathering notch on my armhole. That is where my gathering seams start on the sleeve. And the sleeve is obviously bigger than the armhole because we're gathering on the shoulder. So I'll keep my shoulder notch on my sleeve pinned to the shoulder on the body, and then I'll gather each side of the sleeve crown by pulling on my bobbin threads. When I've gathered the sleeve crown enough to fit the armhole, I'll just pin that in place. And that is what that looks like. I'll do the same thing on the other armhole. I'm going to sew my sleeves on with a French seam, and I know that there are people out there that don't think you should do that, but I genuinely, I have never had an issue with it. If you sew a good proper French seam following the curve of the sleeve and the armhole, then there is no issue. Then I'll iron that seam allowance into the sleeve to really achieve the lifted sleeve look and get the volume I want on my crown. And now as the final step, I am going to attach my collar to my body. So the first thing I will do is prepare the inside collar. So the collar that's gonna be against my neck. I'm going to iron 1 centimeter seam allowance into the collar. I'm not gonna sew it yet, I'm just gonna iron it. It's gonna act as a guidance for me later on. And as you remember, we have 1 centimeter seam allowance on either side of the collar. So really you just fold up to where the collar seam starts. So on my outside collar that's not touching my neck, I have nothing ironed. On my inside collar that is touching my neck or my throat, I have 1 centimeter seam allowance. Fold it up, iron down. So now I'm going to take the edge that is not ironed and pin it to the body. And I have my gathering stitch on my collar, which marks the center front of my collar. So I'm going to pin that to the center front notch on my body. Then I have 2 shoulder notches on either side of the center front notch, which I will pin to my shoulders. And I have my end of my collar, which I'll pin to the back of my body. So what I do, I pin center front, center back, and then I pin shoulder, and then I pin between these notches. This is to evenly distribute the collar around the body. Then I'll sew the collar to the body with 1 centimeter seam allowance. And since I'm doing this in organza, I will cut that seam allowance off half of it. I'll leave 5 millimeter seam allowance, max. I will iron that seam allowance up into the collar, then I'll close my collar with a stitch in the ditch along that seam with my 1 centimeter seam allowance that I ironed down before folded up into the collar. And I'm going to show you how to get the beginning and the end of a stitch in the ditch closure seam nice. So this could be a regular shirt cuff or a regular shirt collar where you have that little connection in the front or like here. So now I have my collar sewn to the body and my inside collar is not sewn to anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that inside edge of the collar. So my collar and body seam allowance is in my right hand, and with my left hand I'm going to take the inside edge of that collar and fold it flat against the body seam, aligning the edge of the inside collar with the edge of the outside collar and the body piece, sandwiching my body piece in between my two collar edges. So on one side, I'm going to have my outside collar piece with the seam that I just sewed, and on the other side, I'm going to have my inside collar piece with no seam. And to get the nicest finish now, I am going to pin this together. I'm going to pin my inside collar edge to the edge of my outside collar and my body piece for as long as I can. I'm not going to be able to pin around the full collar because you're going to have your body piece inside of your collar. So that's just not possible. But I'm gonna pin as far as I can. I'm going to do the same exact thing at the other end. And when you do the other side, you're going to notice that you cannot pin all the way around. It's just not possible. So now when I have my body piece sandwiched between my two collar edges, I will sew on top of that previous seam. This way, at my center back where my collar opens, I will have no seam allowance visible at all. It will all be in my collar. And I'll sew on top of the seam for as long as I can on both edges of my collar. And this is what it will look like. So I'll have my two collar edges sewn shut, and in the middle I will have a hole from the inside. So first, before I flip this inside out, I will cut my seam allowance off again because I don't want it to be visible. If you're not sewing in organza, you don't have to cut your seam allowance. I will not cut my gathering threads though when I cut my seam allowance. I will keep my gathering threads long because I'm going to gather my collar later on. Then I'll pull my collar to right sides facing outwards. And here you can see that all of my seam allowance is enclosed within my collar with no stitching on the outside at all. But now I have a hole on the center of my collar on the inside, which I will need to stitch closed. But before I do that, I will gather my gathering stitch on my center collar. So I'll just pull the bobbin thread until it's gathered to my liking. I will be careful not to pull too much though, because that might create a V pointy neckline here. So I will just keep it a little bit flat at the bottom where it connects to the body, and then I can gather it higher up. And now I will close the opening on my collar from the inside with a stitch in the ditch. So I'll just pin my seam allowance folded up into my collar. I would recommend, if you're doing this in organza, to hand stitch this closed. It's just gonna be a neater finish. I know that I am doing a stitch in the ditch here now, but do as I say, not as I do, okay? I think the ultimate nicest finish on this seam is to do a hand stitch. So I'll just fix my gathering a little bit so I'm happy with how my neckline looks, and then I will just close my collar. Of course, if you're not doing this in organza or a transparent fabric, 100% do the stitch in the ditch. It's the easiest thing, it's the quickest thing. And then when my collar is fully closed, I will just go over my gathering stitch on the center front there with a regular straight stitch back and forth to lock the gathers in place. And that is my last step, but we are done. Good job. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this helpful. Consider liking and subscribing if you did. That helps me out. And yeah, if you sew this piece and post a picture on Instagram, please tag me at Studio Carolina Shearer, same name as here, and use the hashtag #CSChrissy so that I can see what you make. Anyway, that's it for this video. I'll see you next time. Bye!